Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. This is Brandon Vaught. I'm the content director here at Word on Fire, and this is our first episode in the new year of 2020. I'm here with the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, so good to see you after a little bit of a Christmas break. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Always a joy to see you.
Hey,
Happy New Year
catch
to
us
you.
up on your Christmas. I know you went back to Chicago, got to spend time with your family. How was it?
It was fun. I was there just for about a week, and I was probably a little bit too overscheduled. I saw all kinds of people. I don't get back that often, so I see my dear mother and then my family, and then all kinds of friends and people I've known for years. So I was kind of going, morning, noon, and night, seeing folks, but it was fun.
I know you got to spend a little more time with your niece, right? Who you just baptized.
My grandniece.
Grandniece.
My niece's first child.
That's right. And you married them, her parents, and then you baptized your grandniece, right?
That's right. So a couple of years ago, I married them, and then I baptized this baby last, I think it was September. And she's grown up. And
I know you also sent a really cool picture of a great gift that you got. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was a real surprise. There's this box, and I thought, man, what is this? And it didn't feel like a book or like clothes, So I opened it up, and it's my mitt from when I was in Little League, like from the late 1960s. And I think my mother must have had it in her house somewhere because my sister and brother-in-law somehow got it. And I didn't know you could do this, but it was sent away to be kind of, revamped. And they oiled it up and they put new, strings in it and everything. So it was quite a surprise. And I remember it vividly. I remember playing with that mitt when I was a shortstop, So anyway, it was fun.
Have you had a chance to play throw and catch with the new
Not yet.
revamped
No,
mitt?
and I still, to this day, I love playing catch. And so, like when the Word on Fire gang comes out here for events and retreats, there's usually a bunch of us. Then we got some footballs here, and we throw those around. But I love just throwing the baseball around.
Excellent. Well, a couple weeks ago, at the end of 2019, we did an episode on the church fathers, and the plan was just to do one episode on it. But as we started talking about the fathers and introducing them, we got in way over our head. So we only had time to talk about the fathers in general, and then we focused on the three apostolic fathers, Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp. Those were the earliest figures. But I thought for this episode, we could walk through some of the significant figures throughout the next few hundred years after those apostolic fathers. So we're going to break them up as they traditionally are broken up into three different eras. The first one is pre-Nicene fathers. That's before the Council of Nicaea, which happened in 325. And then the Nicene fathers, those who were active in and around the time of the Council of Nicaea, and then post-Nicene. So we'll kind of break them up into those three groups. So let's start with this first group, pre-Nicene fathers. There's tons that we could talk about, dozens. But I wanted to highlight three in particular. The first one is Justin Martyr. So he lived from about 100 to 165. So he's second century. He knew people
really
who
early,
knew
right.
The earliest followers of Jesus. Second is the great Saint Irenaeus. And then the third is that master theologian and biblical interpreter, Origen. So Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen. What should we know about these figures?
We could spend, of course, several semester courses on these figures. Maybe just a word about Justin. You say very early figure. We have a text that's in the Catechism from about 155 that Justin wrote. That's a description of the Mass, what Christians do on Sunday. That is remarkably familiar. If you read that account, ancient account, we can easily recognize, we still do the same thing. It's the structure of the Mass on display. That's from Justin the Martyr. Also with Justin, that idea that I love so much, the semina verbi, right? The seeds of the word. He would have called them logoi spermatikoi in his Greek. Looking around at the environing culture and finding points of contact, seeds of the logos, right? Fully on display in Jesus, but logoi, words that are available in the culture, that's an instinct of Justin that had a massive impact on the rest of the great tradition. Next, Irenaeus, one of my theological heroes. I think I've told you, maybe even on these podcasts, Brandon, that I've got buried in my computer somewhere. You probably know better than anyone. About 30,000 words on Irenaeus. I was writing a book on him many years ago, and for different reasons, it never came to fruition. But I've done a lot of research on Irenaeus. Love him. Early figure. So he says all the time, I was taught by Polycarp, we mentioned, I think, last time, who was taught by John. So you're within 2 generations of one of the apostles. What do you find in Irenaeus? Well, you find, first of all, a very highly developed systematic theology. Within 2 generations, within you might say, ideological earshot of the apostles, you have a fully blown systematic theology. Don't tell me that theology is somehow antipathetic to the primitive simplicity of Christianity. That voice has been heard from the beginning of Christianity until today, that somehow if you're doing too much intellectual work, you're violating that primitive simplicity. Nonsense. From the very earliest days, this very serious figure gives us a full-blown systematic theology. Christians have been stubbornly thinking about the faith from the beginning. Second observation about Irenaeus, he's battling Gnosticism. That's the grit in the oyster around which the pearl forms. I mean, he's battling this Gnostic form. I've argued this many times. The most enduring heresy in the life of the church is Gnosticism. It is alive and well today. And so the insights of Irenaeus from the 2nd century are still valid today. Third observation about Irenaeus is his theology is almost entirely biblical. In other words, he doesn't do, and we'll see the reason now, because Origen is the one that really inaugurates this tradition of setting Christianity in dialogue with an antecedent philosophical system. That's a path taken by many of the great thinkers. Irenaeus doesn't do that. It's a very biblical theology. You can see this tension echoed now up and down the centuries between a theology tending in a more thoroughly biblical direction and one that's more philosophical in style. I don't think that's a bad tension. I don't want to resolve it on one side or the other. I like that tension. I think it's a healthy one. And Irenaeus is one of the first and greatest advocates of a thoroughly biblical approach to theology. There's infinite more we could say about all these figures, but Irenaeus, too, especially for those of us who, in the West are largely trained in an Augustinian framework, Irenaeus in significant ways offers not an opposing vision, but a kind of alternative vision to Augustine. One that's, I think, a bit more optimistic in terms of the salvation of the human race, more optimistic in terms of even how to construe original sin and salvation. Very helpful in regard to understanding a certain evolution within the Bible itself. So people even today will say, well, look, the Bible seems to contradict itself. Irenaeus knew all these tensions, and what he said was the same way you use different language when you're talking to a child, you're talking to an adolescent, you're talking to an adult. So the Bible uses different language when talking to Israel at various stages of its development spiritually. That's a really seminal insight that he had. Anyway, much more we could say about all these great figures.
What I like about both Justin and Irenaeus is very early in the life of the church, 2nd century here, we see a lot of people outside the church attracted to Christianity because of the way they love each other, because of their, unique charitable practices. But very quickly, people have all sorts of intellectual objections to Christianity.
Yeah.
So here comes Justin Martyr, who's maybe the first great apologist of the Christian faith. Here comes Irenaeus correcting distortions of Christian theology. So as you say, from the very beginning, the intellectual tasks of apologetics and evangelization were evident.
It's so interesting, Brandon, because I fought it all my life. To some degree, it's a post-conciliar phenomenon. That's a long story. But a revival of anti-intellectualism, it's always a bad sign. See, I'm with Newman who says, in the spirit of Mary, the Mother of God, who treasured these things in her heart. See, Newman takes that as the great sign of theology, that you don't just dumbly take in the date of revelation. You think about it, you mull it over, you treasure it. That, for Newman, is always a sign of a properly developing Christianity. When Christianity turns anti-intellectual, as it does, and you can notice moments in the history of the church, that's always a bad sign. And so, as I say, I've been fighting it much of my life within Catholicism, but that's a bad strain. Go right back to Irenaeus and Justin the Martyr, and you'll see the insistence upon a logos-based system having to be logical, if I can put it that way. That's Ratzinger, by the way. That's Joseph Ratzinger. If you're a logos-based system, as we clearly are, the logos became flesh. then an illogical or unthinking religion is antipathetic to that inspiration. Okay, end of rant on that subject.
Let's say a quick word about Origen. I know he's somewhat of a controversial figure. Unlike Justin and Irenaeus, he's not a canonized saint of the Catholic Church, but he's universally venerated as a father of the Church. Talk a little bit about who he was and his main contributions.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, I would say with Augustine, the most important father. If I were saying who's the most important Western father, Augustine. The most important Eastern father, I wouldn't really hesitate to say Origen. Now, why? Well, first of all, maybe a little bit about him. An Egyptian, hence his name, Horus Janus, born of Horus. So it's an old Egyptian name. He's from Alexandria, this major cultural center. That goes back to the time of Alexander the Great. But this center of thought that represented the coming together of many cultures. Think of Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish influence. And of course, the Hellenizing and Platonizing influence. I mean, all of that is in Alexandria. And Origen becomes, at the age of 18, the head of the catechetical school of Alexandria. So he's in it. He's in the mix from the very beginning. Now, let me draw the contrast with Irenaeus. I mentioned he's a thoroughly biblical theologian. Origen knows the Bible. In fact, probably better than anybody in the ancient world. One of the first truly great, I would say, systematic students of the Bible and of different versions and translations, and someone that took the time to learn Hebrew well enough to translate it, etc. So all of that. But at the same time, Origen, who comes up in this sort of Neoplatonic thought world. By the way, he's a contemporary of the great Plotinus, right? One of the most important of the Neoplatonic philosophers. So Origen is trying, in his deeply biblical way, to effect a synthesis, if you want, between the Bible and the regnant philosophy of the time, Neoplatonism. And hence you get his great works. Without Origen, there's no Thomas Aquinas. So there's a straight line, if you want, between Origen's project, even though the two of them disagree in a lot of ways, but the style of the project to reconcile the regnant philosophy of the time, in Origen's case, Neoplatonism, in Thomas's case, Aristotelianism, many centuries later. But that represents a very important tradition within Christianity. I think of someone I read a lot when I was doing my doctoral work was Paul Tillich, the 20th century Protestant theologian. His colleague, Reinhold Niebuhr, said, oh, Tillich, he's the origin of the 20th century. Because what Tillich's project was to take biblical Christianity and put it in dialogue with, in his case, a sort of post-Heideggerian existentialism, so the dominant philosophy of the 20th century. Anyway, without Origen, you don't have that whole tradition coming up all the way to Thomas Aquinas and then to lots of contemporary people. You mentioned correctly that Origen's a controversial figure. Indeed so, because he takes positions that the church recognized as problematic. I'll name a couple. One is his peculiar view that the world as we know it is to a large degree the result of sin that took place at a purely spiritual level. So you and I have these souls, right, that are in these material bodies. Well, why are we assigned to the level of materiality that we have? Well, it's because to varying degrees we sinned in a previous life. If you didn't sin, you stayed up in this high spiritual dimension. Think of Plato, right? So the Platonic, that the spiritual is higher and so on. Material is a lower level. If you sinned in that previous life, you were assigned to varying degrees. Well, the church, of course, saw that as that's unbiblical. That's just antipathetic to Genesis, that everything God made is good. We're not here as a punishment. So Thomas Aquinas takes Origen to task on that one. Second thing would be his implicit subordinationism. It's a term he wouldn't have known or used, but that's the view that in the Trinitarian life, there's a subordinationism of the Son vis-a-vis the Father, as though the Son is kind of a lesser deity than the Father. So it's ambiguous in Origen, and believe me, Origen scholars will talk all day about this. But it seems to be clear in his writings that the Father he calls ho theos, the God. The Son he calls theos, or he calls him divine, but not the God. And then is there a further subordinationism with the Holy Spirit? Again, the Origen scholars will debate this all day. But there seems to be a subordinationism in his Trinitarian theology. The third thing, maybe most famously today, is this apokatastasis view that all will be reconciled at the end of time. All people will be saved. And Origen claimed to know that. Now, again, to be fair to him, the Origen scholars I know say, oh, yes, in some texts he seems to indicate that. Other texts, no. All right, I'll leave that to the scholars to debate. But the church did say no to apokatastasis, as though we have a knowledge that all people are saved. So for these and other reasons, the church expressed a certain caution in regard to Origen. But see, I want to stress something though, Brandon, and you've said it correctly. Despite all that, the church has recognized enormous value in the writings of Origen, in his biblical commentaries. One thing, if you like Augustine's biblical commentaries and sermons, that means you like Origen, because Augustine cribs it almost completely from Origen. The four senses of Scripture, to read Scripture in a allegorical way, analogical way, all of that comes to us from Origen. And then this constructing of a systematic theology in dialogue with the Arenian philosophy of the time, which many of us would take almost for granted as, yeah, that's what theologians do. That commences with Origen. So for all those reasons, he remains a very important figure.
All right, we're going to have to leave those three figures for now. I know we're zipping through 300 years of church history in like 10 minutes. But Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen. How about, Bishop, real quick, we'll have some book recommendations at the end, but if you could name one or two works by each of these three figures quickly, what would you read of Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen?
Well, Origen is the periarchon is the Greek term, the de principiis in Latin.
Yeah.
On first things.
Principles or first things, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the Richard John Newhouse's magazine, First Things. That comes from Origen. I got an edition of it. It's a couple years ago now. There's a really good bookstore here in Santa Barbara, and I got a new edition of it.
I think Ave Maria Press has a classics line, and they have it's thick. It's 300 or 400 pages of on first principles.
Right. And it's a wild book. I remember as I reread it, I thought, wonderful stuff. And then you're like, wow, there's some wild Egyptian craziness going on here, So that's what's like reading Origen. But the De Principiis is a great text. Irenaeus, of course, is the Adversus Heraeus, the Against the Heresies. Again, massive book. Book 4 of it, it's got the 5 books. Book 4 is often the one that is cited with the most of his thinking. And then the apologetic writings of Justin the Martyr, but you got your whole life to read these people.
All right, let's move forward to the Nicene era. So remember, the Great Council of Nicaea happens in 325, one of the most pivotal moments in the life of the early church. And we're going to look briefly at 2 church fathers who were in and around those times. One is Athanasius, and the second is Gregory of Nyssa. Who are these two guys?
Oh gosh, Athanasius is one of the most important figures in the life of the church, not just intellectually, but in its development. Another Alexandrian. He was deacon and assistant to the bishop called, appropriately, Alexander of Alexandria. And
that worked out well.
In that capacity, he went with his bishop to the Council of Nicaea. And it's one of those things, where in the lives of certain great people, there's a moment that just defines them, especially when they're young. So Athanasius was a young man at the time. He goes to Nicaea. So he's there as these great debates are unfolding. And when the church decided against Arius and took its stand, and we repeat it every Sunday when we recite the Nicene Creed, right? God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. Well, Athanasius, as a young man, a deacon, was there when that language was hammered out. Well, then, as you know, this is, again, another semester course, but in the wake of the Council of Nicaea, things were and weren't resolved. In one way, the church came to its resolution, but in another way, the debate continued. And it was a very roiled century, politically and theologically. Athanasius, with the death of Alexander of Alexandria, becomes himself the bishop of Alexandria, but then is exiled not once, not twice, but 3 times from his see by his theological enemies. That's why, today, Brandon, when those of us who are involved in the theological conversation and it stirs up controversy, There's nothing new about that. That's always been the case. And poor Athanasius is hounded by his theological enemies because Arianism didn't just go away. In fact, it became quite powerful in the years after Nicaea. For details, read Newman's great Arians of the 4th century if you want that whole story. But Athanasius is the great figure at this time. And one of his nicknames comes here, the Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, because he stood for the Nicene formula against the world, it seemed. Exiled to the far west, he ended up in modern-day France and Germany at one point. Made his way back painfully, the second time and a third time. He writes his great texts in response to these concerns, Trinitarian, incarnational. His De Incarnatione, about the incarnation, it becomes a classic text. His way of resolving issues of Trinitarian theology, and especially soteriology. When I used to teach Athanasius to my first-year students at Mundelein, I had them read the great text on Christology. And he makes this very simple but penetrating observation. If Jesus is not truly human, then we're not saved. In other words, he hasn't gotten into our humanity. If he's not truly divine, then we're not saved. If he's simply a human figure, then he's in the same mess that the rest of us are, right? What spells salvation is the coming together of divinity and humanity, that he's both divine and human. So the great formula of Nicaea for him is not just an abstraction. It has huge soteriological implications. So Athanasius, both as a thinker and as a great, call him churchman of that time. Maybe some people feel contra mundum even now, like, boy, the whole world's coming down on me because of certain things. Well, join the club. That was Athanasius.
I just reread his great On the Incarnation throughout Advent, and I got this version of the book from St. Vladimir's Press, it's an Eastern Orthodox press, but it contains that famous foreword by C.S. Lewis, who one of the last things he wrote was this introduction to Athanasius' book. And in that foreword, he makes the case that we often get intimidated by these great figures, these early philosophers, the ancient Greeks, or these early church father theologians, and we're tempted to just read secondary and tertiary literature on them, reading the commentators on them. But he says one of the marks of their greatness is their readability. Like, read these guys and you can take them in. And I found that true of Athanasius. His book is short. It's maybe, 70 pages or so, but it's so lucid and beautiful. It's not about the incarnation, like the nativity story, but it's the whole fact that Christ took on human flesh, that he became human. So I highly recommend that particular edition. Okay, how about let's hop to the east now and talk about Gregory of Nyssa. Who was he?
Well, of course, Athanasius is Eastern too. I mean, he's an Alexandrian. And you're right that one of the great divisions of the fathers is East-West. And it's very interesting to look at that. People that come out of Alexandria, like Origen, like Athanasius, like Clement of Alexandria, for example, have a certain style of theologizing. But with Gregory, you're correct. We're going further east from Alexandria. You're going into what's called Cappadocia. So it's that far eastern end of modern-day Turkey. So Gregory is, I would say, the greatest of the so-called Cappadocian fathers. This includes Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, and Basil the Great. These three figures, and they're all interesting, are flourishing around the mid to late 4th century. So now Nicaea has happened. Athanasius is contra mundum, and he's getting exiled and everything else. The Arians are flourishing in so many ways. These three great figures begin to formulate the language and conceptuality by which Nicaea could be defended against the Arians. So we owe that to the Cappadocians, and that's a giant contribution. In a way, without them, no Augustine, because Augustine and the West can take advantage of some of the conceptual distinctions made by these Eastern fathers. See, remember, Brandon, maybe there's a comparison to the sciences here that's applicable. We can look with a certain condescension centuries ago, like, oh, those poor scientists, they didn't know that much. But we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and we know more than they, but only because we're standing on their shoulders. They made the distinctions and clarifications and did the experiments that ground modern science. Well, in a way, that's true of these people. the Cappadocians made some of the moves intellectually that made later Trinitarian theology possible. When you mentioned Gregor of Nyssa, I can't help but go back to my Doktorvater, they say in German, my doctoral director in Paris, Michel Corbin. One of the earliest classes I had with Corbin, he said to us, I've just turned 50. And he said, when I was a young man, I read, Hegel and Marx and Heidegger, and he named all the, big cultural figures. And he said, maintenant que j'ai 50 ans, now that I have 50 years, je lis Grégoire de Nice. I'm reading Gregor of Nyssa. And at the time, I don't think I'd read much of Gregor of Nyssa, but it just struck me that this great figure who knew the tradition exceptionally well, knew the contemporary scene, but said, now that I'm kind of in the second half of my life, I go back to Gregor of Nyssa. His wonderful book called The Life of Moses. Get that if you want an introduction to Gregory. It's a originistic, in many ways, allegorical reading of the Moses story as an allegory of the spiritual journey. But one of the great Cappadocian fathers.
All right. Well, as predicted, we have already hit our limit here, and we've barely scratched the surface. If you're okay with it, Bishop, how about next week we'll wrap up with the third episode on the post-Nicene fathers. Just real quick, I know I got several emails after the first episode asking for more book recommendations, so I got a couple more for you. Jimmy Aiken, who is at Catholic Answers, has a book called The Fathers Know Best, where he's arranged excerpts of the fathers' writings topically, so you can look up a topic, see what the fathers say about it. Rod Bennett has a great book called Four Witnesses, the Early Church in Her Own Words. And these cover the four apostolic fathers we mentioned last episode. And then finally, Marcelino D'Ambrosio has a book called When the Church Was Young that looks at not just the church fathers, but some of the non-biblical early Christian texts from the first few centuries. Those are all great. So if you want to dig more into the fathers, check those out.
But I'm with you too, Brandon, in saying, to read the fathers themselves. And I'm furthermore with you. I'll close with this, I promise. The great Walter Kaufmann, who was a 20th century philosophical commentator, made this observation I've always thought was dead right, that it's the greatest philosophers are the best writers that write most lucidly. We have this tendency, it's a bad instinct, he thought, to associate like densely complex prose with deep thought. Kaufmann suggested au contraire, that actually when you've got this densely unreadable prose, it's masking bad thought, that the best people, now of course Thomas Aquinas comes to mind, write in the most lucid way. C.S. Lewis comes to mind, right? Anyway, so read the fathers themselves, and I think you'll find that.
Yeah, actually, I did have one more thing here. If you want primary sources, in other words, if you want to read the father's own words, there's a very famous series by William Jurgens. It's a 3-set thing called The Faith of the Early Fathers, where he takes the most popular texts and excerpts from each of the fathers and just lays them out with helpful notes and stuff. So if you want to just anthology of the fathers, check that one out.
Good.
Well, that sound means it is time for our question from one of our listeners. We love hearing from everyone who listens to the show. If you have a question, please send it in. You can record it by visiting askbishopbarron.com. Today we have a question from Stephanie in your state, Bishop, San Diego, California.
Okay.
She's asking about purgatory, heaven, and its relation to time. So here's her question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. This is Stephanie from San Diego. My question is about heaven and time. I have heard that heaven exists outside of time. But if people are dying or leaving purgatory to enter heaven, doesn't that create a sequence of events, and hence time as we understand it? Because someone was not in heaven, and then they are. There is a before and after. Or does this somehow tie into the reason for the final judgment? Thanks for your insights.
Yeah, thanks. I always like these kind of searching philosophical questions. And it's a famous conundrum in a way, because you correctly point out, when we're talking about heaven or God's dimension, we're not talking about endless time, but something that's outside of time. And we don't really know what that means. I would challenge anyone to say, I got a clear and distinct idea of what it means to be outside of time, because our whole experience is temporal. It's like saying, I know what it's like to be beyond space. Well, we don't. Everything we experience is spatial and temporal. So that's why the biblical citation, right? Eye has not seen, ear has not heard what God's prepared for those who love him is always applicable here. We don't really know what we're talking about. I would say in terms of the transition between purgatory and heaven, don't think of that in terms of ordinary space-time relationships. Whatever that succession is, I wouldn't describe it as a temporal succession in the ordinary way, but an ontological transition, if you want. But I realize the dilemma of it because we're talking about bodies. If heaven isn't a place where bodies are, and indeed we say that, then isn't there something like space? Yeah, I think so. Something analogous to it. What that is, I'm not entirely sure, and I don't think anybody is. Are there qualities of the resurrected body? Yeah, says Aquinas, and he describes some of them. What they really mean, for sure, I don't know. Eye is not seen, ear is not heard. So I would trust that there's something wonderful God has prepared for those who love him. It's inclusive of whatever is good, true, and beautiful about space and time, without the negative qualities of space and time. Might be a way to get at it.
Well, thanks for your great question, Stephanie, and thanks to everybody for tuning into this part 2 on the Church Fathers. Again, we'll try to do a third episode next week. We need
part 3.
Probably 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, probably. But thanks again for listening. A couple quick things before we wrap up. First, if you would like to help support this show, we invite you to become a patron. You can do that by visiting wordonfireshow.com/patron. Big shout out to Michael Bison from Massachusetts. He's one of our great patrons, but we'd like you to join him. So again, help support the show, help get it out to more people. Visit wordonfireshow.com/patron. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.